Welcome to JF with Daniel. I'm your host, Rabbi Daniel Levine. Longtime listeners of this podcast will know that in the last year or so, I have taken a deep interest in Jewish mysticism, as I've talked about many times on the podcast before. In my very traditional Orthodox, I'll add for the insider baseball folks, Litvak Jewish education. We did not touch much on both the Kabbalistic Jewish tradition through the Zohar, Isaac Luria, and then certainly not touching much of what we would now consider to be Chassidut. In the last year and a half, I have found the ideas both potent and dangerous, as we talked about last time, and also just generally fascinating and very much breaking the quote unquote traditional orthodoxy of my upbringing. There's probably no person I would rather have a conversation with this than Zevi Slavin. I talked with Zevi about a year and a half ago. Zevi is the host of the Seekers of Unity podcast and YouTube channel, and it is one of the only YouTube channels where I have attempted to watch every single video that is uploaded. So, Zevi, welcome.
Yeah, so good to be here with you, Daniel. It was super fun to chat last time, and I'm it's always part of the great pleasures of this kind of work is that I get to chat with thoughtful and curious and intelligent people like yourself. So thank you for inviting me again to join you.
Amazing. So in a few minutes, just to give listeners a little bit of a roadmap, I see you've been recently doing a lot of these Ask Me Anything pop-ups. So I want to ask you about that and sort of your experience there, but I don't want to start there. I want to start because I've been rereading a bunch of Gershom Scholem's work, and just to reintroduce Gershom Scholem to listeners, 20th century, both Jewish historian and Jewish theorist. He really brought the study of Jewish mysticism back onto the mainstream after the 1800s. It was sort of this certified effort to sweep it under the rug. And Gershom Scholem, to my surprise, and I believe I read this in college, but I didn't really notice it. He really is infatuated with Shabtai Tzvi and Sabatianism. And so I thought I would start there. One, just we can unpack. I don't think I've done an episode on Shabtai Tzvi. So talking about Shabtai Tzvi and then talking a little bit about Scholem's model of messianism and just, how he views the Sabbatian movement as an inflection point. We did not plan this, so I'm kind of throwing you off in the deep end. But if somebody came to you and because it's quite the interesting theory of Scholem, and just to give the theory, and then I'm going to ask you to explain the theory to people that have heard of Gershom Scholem, mid 17th century Ottoman Jew, came out, him and his, sort of prophet Nathan of Gaza. He claimed to be the Messiah, and then eventually converted to Islam. And this is taught in Jewish history as sort of a very small, narrow, both movement and blink in time that sort of fizzled out. And yes, maybe there were a couple crazy people that still held on to hopes that he would once return. But Scholem completely switches the narrative and essentially says that everything that's happened in Judaism in the last 300 years, from Jewish secular movements, the Reform movement, Hasidic Judaism, and Zionism, is all sort of on the dovetails of Shabtai Tzvi. So let's start there. For somebody that is shocked about what I just said in the last 20 seconds, where might you start thinking about this?
Hmm. Yeah, it is fascinating to approach the field of the study of Jewish mysticism, the academic study, from a perspective of like who are the pet mystics, the pet Kabbalists of the various scholars. And it's very clear that for Shalom, as you were saying, that it's Shabtai Tzvi, who is his pet mystic, and he writes a major magnum opus. I don't know how well it's read, but like 500 pages or something, just on the Tzvi and the phenomena around him. Other later scholars like Moshe Dell have their pet Kabbalists like Abulafia and others, and each person kind of has the person that they cling to. And part of I think the lie of academia is that the scholar is uninvolved, or at least the scholar in the period that Scholem is writing is uninvolved with their subject matter. And recent scholarship that's self-critical and self-aware of what scholars are doing, people like Stephen Wasserstorm in his scholarship on the scholarship of religion, points out how people like Scholem, Eliade, Corbin were deeply entangled and involved in the characters that they were unearthing and exploring, and the paradigms through which they are exploring them and bring them to the public light are in some ways um, manifestations of their own ideological, religious, political, theological struggles. And in many ways, I think Shabtai Tzvi represents so much of who Shalom is and what Shalom is trying to do in terms of a person grappling with secularity and German nationalism in the aftermath of the Holocaust, a person grappling with religious mystery, with his own dubious skepticism, a person grappling with dual national identities and messianic you know, intentions and aspirations, and in some ways, really, Sholem is a recreation of, or rather, Sholem's recreation of Shabtai Tzvi in some ways is I think a recreation of Sholem himself through the
Mm.
character, and one can read Sholem's history of Shabtai Tzvi as some sort of projected autobiography, if one wants
No,
to do
that's
that.
really interesting because Shabtai Tzvi is always, at least in, before I read Sholem, Shabtai Tzvi is just, a temporary, either at best embarrassing blimp, at worst, a huge villain of Jewish history. And there was sort of no positive aspect at all. It was like, okay, this was an embarrassing and terrible phenomenon. Scholem, in sort of, he writes this, many hundred-page book. I have not read the book, for full disclaimer, but then he writes this much shorter, but it's still a very long. And he really tries to bring back this idea back into Jewish mainstream, which of course is an idea that in some way I think is rooted in deeper Kabbalah. One of the things that Scholem says, and I'll sort of form this into a question, is that the rabbinic slash halachic tradition that arose after the 2nd century CE, so this is after, just for listeners, 70 CE, the Romans destroy the temple. About 65 years later, there's the failed Messianic Bar Kokhba revolt that results in hundreds of thousands of Jews dead. And in Sholem's mind, the rabbis, in their creation of the Mishnah and then subsequent Talmudic tradition, are really trying to steer away from messianism. Yes, of course, the rabbis in the Talmud have some idea of one day Mashiach will come, and it's in a lot of the prayers that Jews say. And in the medieval tradition, all great Jewish thinkers had to come up with their theory of the Messiah, but it wasn't, tangible in any real way. It was like, oh yeah, that thing that's going to happen way later. The Kabbalistic tradition really challenges that, specifically with, the school in Tzfat and Isaac Luria. But then Shabtai Tzvi, essentially for Sholem at least, represents the period where Jews are done waiting. And for Scholem, this is interesting because he also was around during the, early days of Zionism and moving to, founding statehood. And Scholem kind of explicitly makes this connection of, what is Zionism but of movement saying, hey, we're kind of done waiting around, for the Messiah. We need to actually, bring this in. And, importantly for both Shabtai Tzvi and Zionism, and this also gets into criticism of Zionism, like, Satmar's criticism, for Scholem and Shabtai Tzvi, the ends justify the means. So, yes, you have to break a couple eggs or commit a couple of sins in order to bring about the redemption. But at the end of the day, it's sort of what you need to do. I'm curious because I had this conversation with David Graysboard, who is a scholar of the Inquisition. But what do you think of this general tension, this framework between we have on one side, the legal, halachic, more Talmudic Jewish tradition, on the other side, the sort of mystical, Kabbalistic, more Messianic Jewish tradition? Are these necessarily always in tension with each other? I know it's a big question.
Oh, it's a great big question. It's a great big question. I'll say two things, and this is some fresh reflections from this morning. I'm teaching now a course here on Introduction to Jewish Mysticism, and this morning we discussed some of these important themes. Firstly, to say that we speak about the rabbis, and that covers hundreds of years of the sages of the Mishnah, the Tanaim, and Amoraim, the sages of the Talmud, as if they're some monolith. They all get this one label, Chazal, Chachmatenu Zichronom Levarcha, our sages of blessed memory, as if they're all monolithic, and that's anyone who reads the rabbis closely, and both internal readings and scholarly readings, it's very clear that the rabbis are not monolithic, and there's many different positions, and amongst the rabbis, and this is scholarship that began with people like Max Kedushin, studying rabbinic mysticism, what he calls normal or normative mysticism, to people today like Shraga Bar-On, who's doing work on the four who enter paradise, the four who enter the paradise or the garden narratives, where we
Can you
see
can
that.
you give an overview? Just for listeners that might not, know the shorthands for all these stories. Can you just briefly describe the four who enter narrative?
Sure, totally. Yeah, so there's a narrative. I believe it's in Tractate Chagiga, but it appears also in a handful of the places where there are four sages who enter the paradise. Paradise being a cognate of paradise and meaning garden, maybe also reference to the fourfold interpretation of Torah, which means they're entering the depths and secrets of Torah. And the four sages, Ben Azai, Ben Zoma, Elisha ben Avuya, and Rabbi Kiva all enter, and only one of them enters with their sanity and with their life. One of them, Elisha ben Avuya, loses his faith, another loses their sanity, another loses their life, and only Akiva enters whole and leaves whole. Nichnas b'shalom v'yatza b'shalom. And what's really going on perhaps behind these narratives, as demonstrated by scholars like Shraga Bar-On and others, is that there are many voices within the rabbinic world as to how to properly contend with the mystical. And these are questions that the sages are grappling with. The mystical that they're grappling with is not yet what we would refer to as Kabbalah. It's things like the inner workings of creation and the inner workings of the divine chariot, Maseh Merkava, Maseh Bereshit. It's the journeys into the celestial palaces of the divine or of the self, the Hechalot literature that's very prevalent in that moment as well. But there's a real diversity of positions from within the rabbinic world about how are we supposed to be engaging with these practices and teachings. And I think that tension continues onward, and throughout Jewish history we see a multivocal tradition. Jews love nothing more than to disagree with one another, and the rabbis extol the virtues of disagreeing. Right? It is the Mishnah that tells us that a disagreement for the sake of heaven it will be blessed to continue in perpetuity. So there's a sense of a very noble place for disagreements that is held in the Jewish mind, and that continues throughout Jewish history. I think an important point to make, though, in conjunction with that, is that we do tend to in the modern West conceptualize as the mystical and the legal, the spiritual and the minutia of the law, the spirit and the letter, as two separate realms. But if we look at the history of Jewish mysticism and the history of Jewish law, it's very evidently clear immediately that the greatest halachic minds of Jewish tradition were often the greatest mystics of the Jewish tradition. One needs look no further than people like Nachmanides. I would also add people like Maimonides to that list. People like Joseph Cairo in Tzfat, people like Shner Zalman of Leadi, the Alter Rebbe, who are all major, decisive, monumental historical legal figures of Jewish law and jurisprudence, halacha. And there were also major mystics writing extensive ecstatic mystical tomes, engaging with those practices as well. Extensive biblical commentaries from the lens of mysticism, while also writing, extensive, highly complex halachic codes for their brethren. And I think that part of the vision of Jewish mysticism is an integration of body and soul, of spirit and letter, until it is just one Torah that is united, uniting the mind of God and the mind of the human.
Do you think eventually that combination that obviously has a little bit of tension there, you didn't really describe it as tension, but if there is some tension, does eventually that just implode? Meaning there is one way to view the tradition of, Sabatianism. This is just on my mind. I literally just finished the book, The Messianic Idea of Judaism yesterday, which is, so I guess it was fortuitous that we're having this conversation now because it's right on my mind. But the way that Scholem almost presents it as, okay, you have these two forces and, they can be contained until something happens. For Scholem, the thing that something happens is the being kicked out of Spain and the subsequent Inquisition. And this did two things. One, this cataclysmic event that, again, in the post-20th century Jewish world is sort of hard to imagine, but the Inquisition, was the Holocaust of, the late medieval period in Judaism. This was the most successful Jewish community for hundreds of years. And, all of a sudden, within a couple of years, Jews are kicked out, and not just Jews are kicked out, more Jews than not actually convert to Christianity, which is seen as probably even worse than being, kicked out. So one, there was sort of that, huge rupture that happened in Jewish life. On the other hand, you mentioned, one of the interesting things about a lot of this mystical or Hechalot literature is that a lot of it's turning inwards, whereas a lot of at least public legal practice is something that's focused outwards. And in this dichotomy of, say, the Inquisition, you actually had Jews who were internally Jewish and externally not Jewish. So this dichotomy between inwards and outwards began to become a lot more meaningful, to the point where, you actually still had groups in the 20th century that were internally Jews, but say externally Muslim or externally Christian, whether we're talking about, the Dunmen in Turkey, also followers of Shabtai Tzvi, or, Frankis in Poland, also followers of, Shabtai Tzvi's, quote unquote disciple. So it's all well and good to say, okay, in the figure of Nachmanides, maybe he can, which of course he both had, both the halachic prowess. I mean, any yeshiva bachar knows you're not making it through a legal Talmudic sugya without seeing what the Ramban has to say, and you're also probably not making through a, commentary, a Kabbalistic commentary on the weekly Torah portion without seeing what the Ramban has to say. But maybe eventually that ends up imploding, or maybe not. Maybe, Shabtai Tzvi and that sort of tradition should be seen as sort of an aberration. And, there's hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of Hasidic Jews today that are still fully in allegiance to halacha and also mystical. So I'll throw that back to you.
It's a great question, and I love thinking about these questions about kind of what is the internal pressures and logics in mysticism, both in Judaism and out and elsewhere, because I think ultimately mysticism is a human phenomena, and as such we can examine it across cultures and understand it, on its own terms a little better. Um, I, I I think that the assumption in the question, which is that there is some sort of inherent tension in Judaism between the halachic and the mystical, the revealed and hidden aspects of Torah, and that is kind of coming to a boiling point and an explosion or implosion in the character and movement surrounding Shabtai Tzvi. I think that I would probably think about it a little differently. I think that what we're actually seeing in Tzvi is the theology of Isaac Luria taken to its furthest degrees. And I'll lay that out a little. So Isaac Luria, 16th century Jewish mystic, um, arguably the greatest, most influential Jewish mystic of all times. Um, the history of Kabbalah is kind of charted pre-Lurianic and then post-Luria. We have Lurianic Kabbalah and almost nothing else. And Luria really, in 2 very short years, that he is living with the great mystics and sages of Tzfat and holding court there, really recreates entire worlds, building off Cordovera and building off the Zohar and building off all the resources, but really revolutionizes the entire world of Jewish mysticism in phenomenal and unprecedented ways, including revolutionizing halakha and Jewish practice. I mean, so many of the most popular Jewish practices, even in the liberal Jewish world today, are directly downstream from the Kabbalists of Luria and his circle. We think of things like Kabbalat Shabbat, and the practice of having liturgy and songs before Ma'ariv, before the evening prayer of Shabbat, is directly a result of the Kabbalists innovating those things. And the liturgy which we read are poems, are Kabbalistic poems created by the Kabbalists. This is a practice now which is not just present in Kabbalistic forms or Hasidic forms of Judaism, but really Judaism across the board. I think of things like Tikkun Leil Shavuot, the practice of staying up all night studying Torah on Shavuot, again instituted by the Kabbalists, and the list goes on and on. But Luria puts something into play, and Luria puts logic into play, and puts an imagination into play. And I think what we see in Shabtai Tzvi, who is a student, um, a historical student of a conceptual student of Luria, is taking Luria's own conceptions and really pushing them beyond any borders and any boundaries of orthodoxy. And I think that the logic of mysticism is both a compelling and a dangerous one. And mysticism has guardrails. We were chatting before about mysticism in the rabbinic period and in the amongst the sages of the Mishnah and the Talmud. And in those sages, there's clear delineations and limitations on what questions and what subjects is one allowed to ponder about and which ones are we not. Before, how many students can we teach about a certain mystical subject? What age does one have to be, and what preparations one have to make in order to be worthy? So there are very clear social, religious, theological boundaries and guidelines around the danger of mysticism. And in some way that recapitulates the moment at Sinai where God tells Moses, Hagbel es Hahar, to set up a perimeter around the mountain. There's about to be a moment of theophany. God is about to consume the mountain in fire, and anyone who touches the fire will die. And as we saw from the narrative of the 4 who enter the garden, one dies, one loses their mind, one becomes an apostate. Only Akiva enters whole and leaves whole. So for the rabbis and for Jewish, the way that Jews historically think about mysticism is as something which is powerful and therefore dangerous, and therefore there must be preparation made, and there must be guardrails set in place about how and who approaches it and when. And I think what happens with Shabtai Tzvi is that for whatever reasons, those guardrails are just entirely let down, and it is Lurianic Kabbalah taken to its furthest logical conclusions without any guardrails. And I think that something that you mentioned earlier, that Tzvi ends up breaking halacha, he ends up merging into a space that scholars will refer to as antinomian, as against the nomos, against the law, breaking the law, as some kind of mistake. I don't think it's a mistake that he becomes antinomian. It is central to his theology, as articulated by Nathan of Gaza and by many of his subsequent followers, that the way that we bring about the rectification of the world, the goal of the Kabbalists, is through engaging in the darkest fallen places where the sparks of the divine have gone, namely into the realm of sin and transgression. I'm not endorsing a transgressive form of mysticism. I think what Tzvi does is incredibly dangerous and harmful, and ruins Jewish families, not just of his own day, but for long times to come. He destabilizes entire communities. He shatters the faith in religious leadership for generations in a way that I don't think is ever repaired since him. I mean, the calamity that he brings on the Jewish world is immense. But I think that he's following a logic. He's following the logic of Lurianic Kabbalah to its furthest degrees. And I think that it's not so much perhaps a tension of halacha, of Jewish law and practice versus the mystical versus the ecstatic versus the contemplative and the spiritual. Because I think there's a deep engagement in the way that they are transgressing is hyper ritualized, is hyper
Mm.
halachic even in some sense. It is in the confines of he one of the moments of shock value is that he marries a Torah and then he marries a prostitute, and these are all done within this reimagined legal context. So it's not as if he's running away from the law. He's not anomian, he's antinomian. He's using nomos, he's using halacha to subvert it because he believes that's what has to be done in order for the Messiah to come, based on his understanding of Lurianic mysticism unhinged. It's a perversion of Luria, and certainly, if history is any indicator, a dangerous and disastrous perversion of Luria. And but I think it's intrinsic to the logic of mysticism and Lurianic mysticism, which we can get into, as opposed to intrinsic to any kind of tension between spirit and letter, between body and soul.
It is one of the most interesting anecdotes that, just from, because I've been doing a deep dive into this topic over the last few months, where you had a lot of these, crypto Sabbateans. So, these are people that were fronting, normative, traditional Jewish to the wider community. This is even, post Shabtai Tzvi, but internally they were, Sabbatean, in the extent where they still believe that Shabtai Tzvi would one day return. And so these people would specifically become experts in halacha for them to subsequently, ritually break it. So I like that you said it wasn't anomian. It's not, the disposition that, say, a lot of Jews have towards halacha today, which is, I don't specifically eat kosher, I don't specifically eat non-kosher. It's just like, not something I think about. For the Sabbateans, it was, I'm going to learn the exact rules of kosher down to a T and practice that most of the time for the one time where I'm, ritually sinning in order for it to have that much more power. What you do have, and maybe this is me, I don't know if this is pushing back a little bit or, asking for a little bit of a clarification. If we're taking the assumption, if you disagree with the assumption, also let me know, that law, we can either think of, Jewish law or even, any legal system fundamentally acts as a conservative force within, society. And I think that's certainly true within Judaism. In order to, and this is, even implicit in what you're saying, the rabbis who were legal minds, even in their mysticism, they try to give, legal constraints, the more conservative tradition. If one wants to exact or excite radical change within the Jewish world, as we've seen in the last 200 years with the Haskalah and, say, the Reform movement, and then, what Scholem, ultimately gets around to is Zionism, because that's what he was dealing with. It almost is another way of saying, in order to usher in a movement like Zionism, that in some way is sort of the perfect encapsulation of this, because it's somewhat traditional and somewhat radical at the same time, sort of paradoxical like that. One actually does need to dip into this tradition a lot more than sort of more quote unquote conservative types might want. And it's not unnoticed by both Scholem and then other people, where Isaac Luria, one of the most interesting things about his philosophy, and totally understandable for his time, he gives a philosophy or theology of galut, of exile, right? So for him, it wasn't some accident of history or even a divine punishment, as maybe the rabbis in the Talmud, they say, okay, the temple was destroyed because of punishment. In Musaf, we say, right, it's because of our sins, right? It's some sort of punishment. the Arizal, Isaac Luria, says, no, it's actually, we need Jews in every corner of the world because that's where there are sparks. And so this is a sort of a diasporic attitude. Shabtai Tzvi, he wasn't necessarily calling for, obviously, a Jewish state the same way that we have now, but a lot of his philosophy was centered around the land of Israel, right? The same as Zionists. So there is this tension, which I found just super interesting. I was talking to Shaul Magid, about a month ago, about Satmar, and he has a new book coming out on Yoel Teitelbaum, and Teitelbaum, who's the Satmar Rebbe, just for listeners that hadn't seen that episode, probably the most vehement 20th century critic of Zionism. You can go look at that episode for all the reasons why. He explicitly makes this connection of calling Zionism neo-Sabbatean. And so, but it does kind of play around with this idea of, okay, at times, maybe law can't you can't wait around for the slow evolutionary legal process. You have to excite some sort of revolution. Now, this is dangerous, right? The example, I was teaching a class on Jewish law at UC Irvine this past year, and this was, right after the Luigi Mangione shot the healthcare CEO. And in my mind, this was a perfect example of a radical revolutionary act of saying, the law is no longer, relevant to our lives because the law is meant to protect thing A and thing A is not being protected. And so that's sort of like one pathology of the revolutionary mentality, just to, understand it what it is. You also have those forces, obviously, on the American political right. And so obviously there's some sort of middle ground here, but at least one could suggest, and this is, I think, what Scholem's point is, which is why I found it so interesting and troubling at the same time, as somebody, again, who grew up learning that Shabtai Tzvi is sort of some embarrassing accident of history, is for Scholem, you actually needed somebody to take that first plunge into saying, no more with this very conservative, halachic-centric Jewish attitude. We actually, if we're gonna radically change the disposition of Jews in the world, we need a revolution. And so Scholem obviously is not pro-Shabtai Tzvi. I think he would recognize everything you said, but I think he would say Shabtai Tzvi represents an archetype in Jewish history, and that archetype is central to ensuring community survival now. I don't think he would throw out the other half of the tradition, but that's sort of I don't know if that's a pushback. You can let me know if you think that's a pushback or just an additional question there.
Sure. Totally. No, let's unpack that. I think that a lot of the misconception, and a lot of the position that Shalom takes vis-a-vis Shabtai Tzvi and Halacha is as we began by saying, a reflection of his own understanding, as a thoroughly secular German Jew, who does not have a direct and intimate relationship with Halacha, and therefore sees Halacha as a force that is potentially or necessarily conservative, and as inhibiting progress and change and forward movement, the kind that Sean, wants to see. I think that it's interesting because I think it's a injustice to halacha to see it as such. And I think that when you look at the way that halacha is conceptualized, both by many within the classic rabbinic period of Chazal, and certainly within the movement of Jewish mysticism, as we said, great halachic minds abounding there as well, both within amongst the Kabbalists and certainly within the Hasidic thinkers, halacha is almost never seen as law which inhibits and binds and constricts and stops one from progressing either individually or collectively as a people. Halacha, already from the Talmudic sages, already in the Mishnah, is read as the sages in the Mishnah say, "Al tikri halacha, al tikri halichot elam ela halachot elam." Rather, do not read halacha as law, but rather as halichot, as pathways, as ways upon which we journey. Halichot olam, which is a rabbinic phrase, might be translated as sort of eternal pathways or pathways to the eternal, and that is what they're hoping that people hear when they say the word halacha, and not the Greek word nomos, law, which is a word which they don't frankly have in their vocabulary. And I think the superimposition of Western and Greek conceptions on to a Jewish category of halacha turns it into something which is legal, Pharisaic, binding, conservative. But if it's a path is something through which and upon which you progress. These are patterns of life, patterns of Jewish life, which unite us with the infinite, with the divine. And this is very clear for the Kabbalist. Mitzvah is etymologically related to the word tzavtzah, which is to recombine something that has been broken, and that broken is the broken relationship between divinity and humanity that needs to be reconnected, or tzevet, a team that to join us on God's team in some sense. And these are all inherent within the very language of things like halacha and mitzvot. And I think about examples like that when we try to reconceptualize what halacha is from within the Jewish, from within the rabbinic mind, and then certainly from within the Kabbalistic and Hasidic mind. And what we have actually is a form of a form of devotion which allows there to be the which allows the spirit to run through them. An analogy which a very dear friend and colleague of mine, Professor Ariel Evan Mays, refers to halacha as the shores of devotion. That you have banks of the river, and the banks themselves are evolving and changing and sifting of sands, sifting of sands, and through them the waters are able to flow, and through them we're able to have the living waters of Torah flow through those banks. But the banks are always shifting and moving. And if we had no banks, if we just got rid of halacha, as perhaps Shabtai Tzvi and Sholem would like to have, then the water just becomes dispersed and seeps out, and you do not have anything left that is recognizably Jewish. And I think that the fact that Judaism historically has been precisely an orthopraxy by which the practice united us across time is precisely because we have those riverbanks, those shoals of devotion, which allow the spirit to run through them. And there's a deep symbiotic relationship between the shore and the river, between the spirit and the path. And I think this is really true for the rabbinic imagination from day one. And the Kabbalists, we have to kind of re-enter the mind of the Kabbalist as a Jewish thinker, not as a Western German nationalistic secular antinomian thinker. The sages read a very famous episode of when God gives the Ten Commandments to Moses, and anyone who studied some rabbinic literature will know what I'm about to say, that they are charut al haluchot, they are carved, engraved upon the stone tablets. And the rabbis say, al tikri charut el cherut, do not read carved, but rather read freedom upon the tablets. And the sense is that we need to hew something into stone so that we can create channels. And through hewing, through a practice that is as solid as stone, we create freedom that is able to dance and able to sing. And I think that anyone who knows halacha from the inside knows halacha to be something which is life-giving and something which is creates patterns and pathways of access to divinity. And I'm speaking here in an idealized form of halacha. Halacha can also and has historically been used in coercive and abusive, and I want to acknowledge that. But in an idealized form of halacha, in the mind of the Kabbalist, halacha is not something that holds us back from creativity. It is precisely the creative constraints which allow the creativity to flow through. And I hope I'm not coming across as like some sort of apologetic for halacha here. I'm just trying to really enter into the very like etymology and the very constructs through which the Kabbalists are thinking about categories of halacha. They're certainly not thinking about it as law, as nomos, as foreign Greek categories. And I think that we need to ask these questions. And a lot of the scholarship post Scholem, by the way, has been trying to re-ask questions of Jewish mysticism on its own terms. A lot of the corrective work done by Moshe Idel, the great generation of scholar following Scholem, is to stop thinking about Kabbalah as intrinsically and always formed by the non-Jewish world outside it. Certainly, we're in conversation with the larger world. We always are. There's influences there. They're prevalent. They're important. But what is the internal wellspring through which the Jewish mystical tradition flows? And what we've seen is a return to a sense of continuity of rabbinic models, rabbinic mysticism, biblical mysticism, Second Temple mysticism flowing through into the Kabbalist of the Middle Ages and today. I'd love to do the same thing for halakha, to sort of um what's the word I'm looking for, to reclaim that word, and to think about it Jewishly, think about it rabbinically.
Yeah, there's a great book. I actually talked to him by Chaim Seiman, Villanova law professor who writes a book, The Rabbinic Idea. He starts off by talking about this sort of Christian Western category of halacha. It doesn't really make sense to put halacha in there. I'll just add this as sort of my own commentary that obviously much of Judaism has been in parallel to the Christian Greek tradition. And, thinkers like Maimonides, you can't read Maimonides outside of that tradition as well, which might actually speak to the success of Kabbalah, and sort of combating, hey, this, the Maimonidean, at least the mainstream view of Maimonides. We don't have to get into, I think last podcast episode, we discussed whether or not Maimonides could be called a mystic. I'm going to do something that, you might disagree with, but let's Maimonides is not a myth, and just the rationalist, as he's popularly thought as, you can tell why Kabbalah, soon took off after that, because to turn Judaism to something it's not, which is, again, a nomos with a law and a philosophy, not outside of this creativity. I guess I'll try asking, just from one other angle that we have, I've been sort of alluding to Zionism, but we haven't deep dived in. And again, this is, we don't have to discuss politics or anything, but just the idea of Zionism, growing up, and I'm curious to bounce this idea off of you. It's no surprise that 95% of anybody who would have considered themselves a Zionist in the year 1902, let's just pick a random year, was secular. Maybe they were, interested in Jewish ideas like, Achad Ha'am, but they weren't, let's say Shomer Shabbat. I think that there are stories of Achad Ha'am that he would, have Suda Shlishit and sit around singing, but he would be smoking a cigarette, which, is forbidden for, on Shabbat, just for listeners, just to sort of, have the traditionalism, but also be, showing that he's no longer Orthodox. I believe he grew up Hasidic. And it was always taught to me, and I grew up in a religious Zionist community, which obviously did eventually fuse the two, but where, Zionism could have, was just sort of like a jump ball. Like, it just so happened to be that Zionism's founders were predominantly secular, but then soon after, much of the religious world, also got in. I'm starting to think of it a little bit differently, and I don't know if I agree with what I'm about to say, which is why, again, who better to bounce this idea off of, but I'm starting to see it as, no, it actually is only secular Jews who are not playing by, again, the conservative rules of tradition that would be able to come up with an idea as heterodoxical of, as we're just going to go back to Israel ourselves, this place that in our tradition we, obviously love and it's central and we pray for, but that's just it. We pray for it. We don't go back to ourselves and, force the end and rebuild the state and everything like that. And so, again, this says nothing about, my disposition as both, a religious Jew and a Zionist. I still am both. But I'm starting to think of Zionism now as, well, this is really only something that Jews that are outside of the traditional mainstream would have been able to accomplish, which does fit the historic record. And I think it has to do with all these ideas. So I wanted to bounce that question off you. Again, I'm not 100% sure I agree with myself, but I'm curious if you agree with at least one version of myself.
Yeah, I mean, I think the fundamental difference is to what are we attributing the capacity for really any effective activity or agency in our lives. And I think a thoroughly religious perspective is that anything which, and this is certainly true for Jewish mysticism, but also I think true for general Judaism, that anything that we're able to achieve is only through the ability of God who gives us the power to do so. I mean, from a very classic Jewish perspective, we begin every morning by saying Modeh ani lefanecha melech chai v'kayim shechazarta b'nishmati b'chemla rabbi emrotecha. We thank God for giving us back our souls, whom we entrusted to God before we go to sleep. And it's only in God's grace, in God's great mercy, Rabbi Monotecha, and God's great faith in us and trust in us, that we're able to breathe for the first time in the morning and to put our feet on the ground. And from a perspective of traditional Jewish liturgy, when we put our feet on the ground, or at least originally how it was composed, we would say, "Thank you, God, for allowing me to put my feet on the ground." And then another blessing, "Thank you, God, for allowing me to stand up straight. Thank you, God, for allowing me to." And I think there's a deep sense that our every breath, or every action, or every movement, is only possible by the grace of God. We use the bathroom and we say, practicing Jews till today still say blessing every time they use the bathroom. "Thank you, God, for allowing all of my bodily functions to work." You know, and I think that sense of living on the constant grace of God, which is a fundamentally religious notion, a fundamentally Jewish notion, is deeply paradoxical and deeply in opposition to a secular atheistic notion in which, no, we have agency, we have power, we can achieve things with our bodies and in time and on the global scale. The slogan of secular Zionism in the eyes of the religious community was "Kochi ve'otzim yadi aseli et hachayil hazot," which is a biblical quote, which means that it is my own might and my own strength through which I've been able to achieve this. And I think that comes down to perhaps the fundamental distinction between what might be a religious Zionism and a secular Zionism, which is through whose power and agency have I been able to achieve anything in this world at all, including the establishment of a modern state. Is that through the exclusive agency and power of God, to whom the glory belongs, or is it our own strength and our own ingenuity? And I think in a sense, when conceptualized as an activity that we are doing by our own strength and on our own accord, if I'm understanding the question correctly, that to me is a fundamentally secular conception. which is certainly not present in the history of Jewish thought, or history of religious Jewish thought. And I mean, and there are great moments. We just read Parshat Shalach, in which we have the narrative of the spies that are sent to spy the land of Israel, and subsequently following them, there is a contingent of Jews who regret not believing in God enough that God could conquer the people that were inhabiting the land, and they decide they're going to ascend on their own. And the biblical narrative is that they are struck down, and that's a narrative which is really reiterated a whole lot throughout Jewish literature from the Bible and onwards. That if we think that we can do anything on our own without God's blessing, then we will have no success. So to me, it's not so much a question of the activity per se being secular religious, but are to whom do we attribute the capacity for that activity and power to take place, and that does change the nature of the undertaking. But I think in that sense, Zionism is thoroughly secular when it's perceived to be self-agentic.
But this is sort of the tension that I think is implicit there, where I always sort of joke that if you pop into a time machine and pop into a Jewish community in the year 1700 and you tell people in 2025 there's going to be, a bustling state of Israel, and it's going to be, all the statistics that we can name about, all the good of Israel and the GDP and whatever, they would say, I am 100% sure that coincided with, the Messianic period. And then if you told them, pop into the other half of the communities and you were to say, well, in the year 2025, the Messiah, hasn't come yet, we're still waiting. In their mind, that would have been, okay, of course there is no Jewish state. And so there is a little bit of tension, so I think I am going to try to push you a little bit more where, the verse that you said before, I believe, is that's from Devarim or Deuteronomy, and it's not a positive verse, right? That's, Moshe warning the people, you're going to go to the land, you're going to get all cocky, you're going to think, you can do stuff yourself, and then you're going to see if you don't have God, you're going to fail. The secular Zionist sort of manifesto, again, this is not a position that I even necessarily agree with, but what they would say is, well, we did it and it worked, and we did it specifically without God. I mean, at least in their mind, without explicit, beseeching God, and without prayers, and while working the fields on Sukkot as if it was just any other normal field day, and whatever. And so what they would say is sort of the time of Jewish traditionalism, messianism, waiting around. That's just been that's sort of interesting, and maybe, we can read about it. And, obviously, even in the early Zionist educational curriculum, they didn't touch much on the, Talmudic and medieval and Kabbalistic tradition. It was sort of, Tanakh as ancient literature plus, the last 100 years of the Haskalah. And so what a secular Zionist, if Herzl popped into the Zoom call after, we probably have some other questions for him, but if we then, tried to talk to him about these ideas, he would say, well, I don't know what they're talking about. This was clearly, at least the mission that he laid out. He obviously died long before he got to see his fruits going to fruition, but he would say, this clearly was we have to act. This is us. This is a human-centric program. And okay, it's all great and well if religious people eventually come around to this project, which of course is what happened. But I think he would maybe push back, not maybe, he would strongly push back on this this depiction of, well, yeah, but it's really because it's God was sort of aiding it at the same time. So that's I think a little bit more, and then I'll stop bothering you with pushing back, because I do want to hear how these I'm a Jew, ask me anything things go. But I'll give you the last word on this.
No, sure, no, with pleasure. Um, Yeah, I mean, I think there's a few things going on here. I think that you just mentioned that you'd been reading Scholem's book on the Messianic idea in Judaism, and scholars post Scholem objected to the very notion of the title that there is any one Messianic idea in Judaism, but there are many Messianic ideas within Judaism. And I think that what happens sometimes is that we have naive, simplistic, and juvenile conceptions of religion and theology, while we continue to advance and gain further education in every other area of our lives. Our religious education often stays in childhood, and for many of the secular Jews that were involved in the early Zionistic project, that may have been even less the case. And or the selection bias of what aspects of Jewish knowledge, as you were indicating, Tanakh and Haskalah and others were entirely absent, leaves us with a very large void and vacuum and lacuna of what are the messianic imaginations in Judaism. And I think that Judaism, I mean, I'm a proponent and advocate and educator for Jewish mysticism because I believe there's a tremendous amount of wisdom there, from which we have to learn. And I think that there is a true sense, and this is popularized by Kabbalists beginning in the Middle Ages and onwards, that there is no external redemption of the world unless we're able to heal ourselves, unless we're able to unite our own internal psyches, to unite our bodies, to unite our thought, speech, and action, to act as unified entities. And the Kabbalists will frame that in theological language that we're uniting Kodesh Baruch and Shekhinah, we're uniting our soul with God, but from a very purely like sort of psycho-spiritual perspective, it means that we have to be whole humans. We have to come to a place of completeness. It is Akiva, we said earlier, who enters the garden complete and leaves complete. He is nichnas b'shalom and leaves b'shalom. He leaves whole. Often maybe mistranslated as he enters in peace and leaves in peace, but he enters whole, he enters complete, and he leaves complete. And the Jewish mystics, from their imagination, from their perspective, there is a sense of reality in which we're living, in which we perceive ourselves to be fundamentally alienated from the rest of reality around us, and that is a state of internal exile, a state of misapprehension of the true nature of reality. And they thoroughly believe that the human is a moment of the infinite, and that when we recognize our true nature, then we can begin to live in harmony with the rest of reality, and human, more than human and divine. And that's the process of redemption that the Kabbalists speak about all the way from Abulafia onwards. And the language that this gets in Chassidut is that there is a geula pratit, there is a internal redemptive process that has to take place, and only when there's enough of us that have reached that stage, and I'm still working on that, do we reach a tipping point where we have a geula klalit, where we have a external manifestation. And I think part of the secular religious dichotomy that we're touching on here as well is that there's a secular mindset, which is that things are changed in the external world, and that is where the real work happens, and that's where change happens. And I think there's a religious voice which says real change, and this has become cliche enough that it could be like a Hallmark card or like a something, but real change is within, and for the Jewish mystics, and the Jewish mystics is saying this long before the advent of modernity, which is the turn to the individual, the turn to the interiority of the human and the human psyche. And the Jewish mystics thoroughly believe that if we're going to be living in a rectified world, it begins by rectifying ourselves. Contra Immanuel Kant, the great German Enlightenment philosopher, who said that out of the crooked timber of humanity, nothing straight can be built. The Kabbalists believe that the human fundamentally was pure and divine. Returning back to the morning blessings that we've been harping on, we pray in the morning. We praise God and we say, Neshama Elohai, my God, Neshama shenatata bi tahora, the soul that you have given me is pure. Ata berata, you created her. Ata yitzarta, you formed her. V'ata nafachta bi, and you have blown her within me. There's a sense that the human is fundamentally pure because the divine within them is pure, and that is infinite. And that redemptive process begins within. And I think that a thoroughly religious conception, a thoroughly mystical conception of messianism is a process of internal healing, which then allows us to live in harmony with each other and with nature. And I don't know if rushing to statehood and rushing to external forms of liberation can achieve anything if we don't change ourselves on the inside. I think that Scholem's great successor in some ways, Moshe Idel, who writes his own book on messianism in the mind of the mystics, does a far better job in capturing this internal sense that the mystic is trying to get at. And I highly recommend reading Idel's book, Messianic Mystics, I think is the title, in conjunction with Scholem's book, and to see how that Scholem really misses, I think, what a lot of the point of messianism is, in his own secularism, in his own attempt, in his own nationalism, in his own attempt to see messianism. He describes Chassidut as messianism neutralized, which to me is like a totally crazy thing to say. And until I read Idel, I was like, oh, it's just me who thinks that this is totally off the mark. But Idel makes a very strong case that it's not a neutralization of messianism, it's an interiorization of messianism, and that's not a devaluing of it. That's precisely bringing the change to where it needs to happen. And I think that as modern humans, we can understand the value of needing to, again, to quote an overused slogan attributed to Gandhi, to be the change that we want to see in the world. And I think that the mystics are right on that account.
Yeah, I like how you phrase that. It can only be within this framework of thinking this is a complete dichotomy between tradition and messianism, religion, secular, that one would think Hasidim, by dint of them staying within the traditional area, are giving up on messianism. Yeah, that was also a Arian Scholem. I mean, even before I read Scholem, I sort of knew that was his biggest, at least historic error. He has others certainly, but that was interesting. Haven't read Adele's book yet. Maybe I'll read it and then I'll have to get you for another conversation. I do want to talk a little bit about these Ask Me Anything things. I'll just talk for like 30 seconds. I've listened to them. I really enjoyed them. For the longest time, just on the internet, every time I saw a video of someone camped out anywhere, whether it's political or religious, I was like, come on, like one of these gimmicks. But then 2 years ago, I started on Reddit doing this UC Irvine wide. I did an Ask Me Anything. This was in the months after October 7th, there were a lot of people saying a lot of things about Jews, Israel, Zionism, all of that. And I found it a really rewarding experience, albeit, again, there were some people who just, wanted to use it as, a time to, vent or worse. But I'm curious, just because I have been following you for a couple of years, and that is a relatively recent thing. I mean, what was it sort of a similar, transition to you? Why did you end up doing it? What have you gained from it? You can just kind of talk generally.
Sure, totally. Yeah, a lot of I care about the world that we live in, and I care about the narratives that are shaping that world in ways that are healthy or unhealthy. And I care about the role that theology and religion plays in telling those stories through which we relate to ourselves, each other, and the world around us. And a lot of the educational work that I'm doing is kind of high end. It's very bookish, and it's engaging with scholarship and with history, and there's lots of footnotes and bibliographies, and I'm not devaluing that work. I think there's important work to be done there, particularly in the realm of mysticism, which has been told. The narrative of mysticism has been told so narrowly and parochially, and I want to tell a global human story of mysticism, and I think there's tremendous power there, and I haven't given up on that project. But post October 7, and seeing how online discourse has continued to just devolve into becoming more and more divisive and acrimonious, I felt a bit of a responsibility to do something that would reach people that were not interested in sitting through an hour lecture about the relationship between Maimonides and his Muslim contemporaries.
I don't
Um,
know. Do those people exist? Is there anyone that's not jumping
a
at
small
that?
a small segment of this small segment
Okay.
of the population, and the specific event which precipitated this series that we're doing now, which is I'm Jewish, Ask Me Anything. I was living in Brooklyn at the time, Crown Heights, a Chabad Hasidic neighborhood, and I was walking down Eastern Parkway Shabbat afternoon for a Shabbat lunch meal, and a friend and I both dressed in full Hasidic garb, him in Shtreimel, coming from different Hasidic sects, and myself in Chabad Hasidic dress. There were like a bunch of Jewish people walking down Eastern Parkway towards us, and they kept each one as they passed us told us like, "Oh, don't go near Brooklyn Museum. There's a pro-Palestinian protest. Stay away." And we're not the type of people to stay away, and so we went to the protest, and we walked through the protest, and we interacted with people there. Some interactions were more pleasant, some were less pleasant. Um, and Later, I heard in the news that there were some other Hasidic Jews that had been physically attacked at that same protest. Um, and my main takeaway from the experience of being there was that there just really wasn't much space for dialogue and discourse. And there was a lot of passion, which I respect and appreciate. There was a lot of loud slogans being shouted through megaphones, which have its place. But I was really hoping for something a bit more quiet and a bit more discursive and a bit more dialogical, a bit more two-way. So we kind of made a plan to return following Shabbat, with a big whiteboard which said, "I'm Jewish, ask me anything." Just kind of really open-ended, and show up with curiosity and hospitality. Put down some chairs, microphones, and cameras, and we filmed, a full day there. And the types of questions we got were full range, covering Jewish law and practice and culture and cuisine and politics and Zionism, and just the full gambit of things. And what I noticed was that there was like a real opportunity for people that were even very engaged in pro-Palestinian causes and all kinds of human rights causes, that may not have seen me as someone who they could converse with and be vulnerable with and share with and think with. That became possible when we weren't yelling at each other, but when we were talking face to face and receiving each other with generosity, and with trust. And I mean, I'm a deep believer in the power of encounter and communication, and I show up in those moments. it's phrased as like, oh, I'm Jewish, I'll answer your questions, but it's really phrased for me to come and learn and listen to as much as I'm sharing and talking. And to me, that's real dialogue where both people come willing to hear the other and hear something which they had not yet considered and reconsider their own positions. And I just think we need more of that. I mean, anyone who spends 2 minutes scrolling on any social media platform, it's this one destroys college student, this one destroys professor, this one obliterates uh, social justice warrior, this one, and I'm like, why do we have to be obliterating and destroying each other all the time? What about showing up and listening and hearing and and I mean, it's so crazy because we know this as humans in ordinary interaction. When's the last time you went to the supermarket and destroyed someone? You presumably didn't. Like you went to the supermarket and you had a pleasant interaction with the cashier. You may have disagreed with someone about their politics, and if you spoke about that, there was probably space for disagreement. And the internet creates this fishbowl where like we think that humanity is just engaging each other in ways that are like for this like mutually assured destruction and evisceration and annihilation. And I want to know what it looks like. And to me, this is the message of the mystics. What does it mean to show up with and for humanity for mutually ensured um, growth and eudaimonia and flourishing and happiness and peace and preservation and respect of human life and dignity. And we're not going to agree with one another all the time. I mean, we had major disagreements, and part of those episodes there are like hour-long discussions where we didn't agree on a whole lot, but there were shared concerns and shared fundamentals and ability to see each other in our narratives. And to me, I'm so disappointed by like where we are as humanity that these conversations are exceptions from the rule, and the rule is let's humiliate, let's straw man the other, let's show them how stupid they are. Where do we get with that? And to me, like we really need to return to a place where there's bipartisan concern for human life in ways that are just normal and common and consensus. And that means that there's both a necessity to understand that there is a common goal here of living as humans on this tiny planet together. And despite all of our immense differences, important differences, where can we meet for commonality, which is a vanquishing aisle of commonality, which seems to be every day losing whatever little inches it has left. And secondly, how do I approach the other with whom I have major disagreements and understand them from the depths of their values and not from the worst of their implications? How do I really, really sit and hear the other and morally strawman them in a sense where it's like, oh, I really want to know why you as a conservative, why you as a Republican, why you as a Democrat, why you as a whatever persuasion, religious, political, social one is coming from. I want to understand. I want to make a good faith assumption that you're doing this not out of malice, but you're doing this out of your care and concern. And if we can make that assumption of one another, then I can begin to hear and understand where you're coming from. And I may not agree with you at the end of the day, but at least I'll understand that there's a shared common common will that is hoping for a better tomorrow for all of us and for our children. And to me, like this is the mystics are just keep hopping on about this. Like the Jewish mystics keep telling us, like we are one body. Like when we commit violence against one another, we are committing violence against ourselves and against the divine. And when we're able to come into communication with one another, we're in communication with ourselves. And to me, it's the message of mysticism. It's the work that I'm doing on the channel in the more abstract theoretical, which informs my social engagement on that end. And I think that's been resonating with people. I mean, the series has done in long form episodes, which are like 40, 50 minutes, over 500,000 views. The short form have done well over 3, 4 million views in terms of the snippets that are being edited from them. So people are really resonating with the ability to show up with open arms and to show up with a smile and to show up with curiosity and to show up with respect for one another. I'll just leave with one final anecdote, which has not yet been published, but will be coming out in the next few weeks. While I've been living in Northern California a little, and I tabled with another friend of mine in UC Cal, which is in Berkeley, and we had a very sweet young Muslim woman come over, and we were chatting about Muhammad and about Moses and about this and that. And it was a very respectful conversation, a conversation in which we disagreed about fundamental assumptions about the nature of revelation and prophecy. But despite all that, we were able to vocally and intentionally walk away with a deeper appreciation, her for the Prophet Moses, myself for the Prophet Muhammad. And the sentiment there was that if two religious people leave a conversation and their faiths are lesser as a result, that is a failure of religious conversation. If two people of different faith come together to conversation and leave with greater faith in their respective faiths, then that is a successful conversation between people of faith. And I think that's the same true for politics. Like I want to embolden people that have values that are contrary, or that have politics that are contrary to mine, but have values that are shared with mine. I want them to be living from their values, and I want to understand their values. And to me, this is just, to me, there, if we head down the path of like X destroys Y and Z destroys and obliterates, then we're heading towards a path of mutual obliteration. Like we're heading towards mutually assured destruction. And who wants that? Like, and we need a course correct. We, as humanity, we need a course correct in direction of mutually assured prospering. And to me, it feels like a no-brainer, and I think many of the people who have been appreciating the series feel similarly.
Yeah, it's definitely been my experience. I mean, teaching were some of the most intellectually and spiritually engaging conversations are exactly what you're talking about there. Young Christians or Muslims or, even Jews who might be coming with a completely different view on things than mine. It is going to make me rename this. I was going to name this, podcast episode, Daniel Obliterates Zevi on Messianism. But no, I'm totally kidding. But no, it is, I think, exactly what you said. I loved how you encapsulated that. I mean, the reason why I did this Reddit thing 2 years ago was because there was this big encampment in the middle of UCI. And I also was sort of hanging out there as, both the campus rabbi and, teacher in Jewish studies. And it was, there were some people there who were interested in dialogue, but it wasn't very conducive to that. And then on Reddit, it was also by far the most prolific thing I've ever done. I mean, I was shocked at how many people ended up, asking questions. I think it was also in the like 600,000, 700,000 views, which is, far more than anything else I've ever done. And it's been really incredible, which is, one of the reasons why I was intrigued to look at your series, because I think it is so obviously needed. And even just, hanging around campus with a kippah, I feel like oftentimes I don't have the physical sign, but a lot of people almost take it, which is one of the reasons why I wear a kippah. I mean, there's other reasons why I wear a kippah as well, but one of the main reasons is because I always want people to know that they can approach me as somebody who's, Jewish and want to talk to them. And not a day goes by on campus where someone doesn't ask me some question on something. And so,
Yeah.
it is, I think, interesting to just bring it much more explicit to like, all right, we're going to set aside time and place for this. But I love the way that you phrased all of that. I know we've been talking for a while. I don't know if there's any other thoughts or ideas or, that you have there. But I did want to thank you. I'm sure you're, busy soaking up the warm sun of Simi Valley there.
Yeah, no, been enjoying it for sure. I mean, I think what's been remarkable to see is that, as you're saying, and you have this experience as well, being a walking ambassador of Judaism wherever you are, by extension of the way you present yourself with pride and dignity. It's funny when people come over, and we've been now tabling, right on campuses, right in the middle of and right through, very vocal and very aggressive pro-Palestinian protests, and it's interesting to watch people come over, waiting to be attacked and waiting to like attack back, and the second they realize that they're actually, the purpose of this is not to attack anyone, but just to open up space for dialogue and to hear and to share. It's like I immediately see their faces change. There's a line um, from, you may know better which Jewish text it's from, but K'mayim hapanim al panim came lev hadam lev hadam. That, so just as water reflects a face, so too does one heart reflect another heart, and that the intentionality that we show up with in the world um, gives people permission to reflect that back to us. And I think that we have to start thinking about, what does it mean to show up, whether that means as Jews to show up with dignity and honor and respect and pride, and to have that reflected back to us, or if we're not Jewish, to show up with care and concern and respect and dignity. Yeah, and like, I think that we underestimate the power of our own intentionality, and the ways that we choose to show up. And I'm glad you've had that shared experience as well, of showing up with thoughtfulness and kindness, and that's being reciprocated and received.
Yeah, well, that's absolutely beautiful. I just will flag one more time for listeners. Seekers of Unity, very fascinating, both on the popular Ask Me Anything questions and also the, hour long deep dives into these topics. You really do it in a way that is, you make a lot of very dense material very approachable, which I think is a very important talent in these days where people have short attention spans, but yet people will sit through an hour of things if they are organized well. Zevi, thank you so much.
My pleasure. Thank you, Daniel.